Presentaremos también clásicos del Hey Festival, charla de ediciones pasadas inolvidables que nunca pierden vigencia. Y después presentaremos el Hey Forum en Ayacucho, el Hey Forum en Moquegua y el propio Hey Festival Digital Arequipa, todos con grandes invitados nacionales, internacionales, en vivo, de diversas disciplinas como literatura, filosofía, periodismo, ciencia, música, cine. Hoy más que nunca no solo hace falta celebrar lo mejor de las ideas y la creatividad humana, sino también repensar el mundo en que vivimos. Así que larga vida al Hey Festival en Arequipa. Disfruten, muchísimas gracias.
Hola a todos, en nombre de la editorial Paidós y de todo el Grupo Planeta les doy la bienvenida a las conversaciones 75 aniversario Paidós. En estas conversaciones contamos con la colaboración de Iñaki Gabilondo. Gabilondo es un referente del periodismo en España, ganador de 6 premios Ondas y hoy va a conversar con la doctora Shoshana Zuboff. La doctora Zuboff es socióloga, profesora emérita en la Harvard Business School y también en la Harvard Law School. Autora de varios conceptos originales que nos permiten comprender la realidad compleja que nos rodea y recientemente ha publicado su último estudio, La era del capitalismo de la vigilancia, que es una monumental investigación sobre el uso que hacen las grandes empresas tecnológicas de la información personal que les proporcionamos. Tanto a la doctora Zuboff como a Iñaki Gabilondo les damos las gracias por compartir esta conversación con nosotros, también a la organización del Hey Festival Digital Arequipa 2020 y a todos ustedes que nos acompañan hoy.
Señora Zuboff, un saludo muy afectuoso. Antes que nada, quisiera expresarle mi admiración por el libro formidable que ha escrito usted, enorme. Y mi primera pregunta es referida precisamente al gigantesco trabajo que ha hecho usted. Porque en este libro, que tiene casi 900 páginas, pero tiene 150 páginas de citas o de referencias. Digamos, es un libro extraordinariamente trabajado.
Yes. Yes, well, you can see the gray hairs and the circles under my eyes. This was a long work, as you say, but to me it felt very necessary. The discoveries that I made and the conclusions that I came to and their consequences for this century are all very, very grave and very important for people in all of our countries to understand and to embrace and to mobilize as a result of this understanding. So my belief was that I had to give every day, every week, every month, every year that I possibly could, that was truly demanded by this work, in order to be complete, to be comprehensive, to read everything, to review everything, to do the kind of profound research that when you finally read this book, you can trust that this is not only an opinion, it's not only a point of view, but it's rooted in deep and extensive research. That was the kind of tranquility and assurance and confidence that I wanted to give my readers all over the world. And I hope I've accomplished that.
Lo que usted hace, creo, señora Zuboff, es lanzar un mensaje de alarma, de alerta. Es como una sirena de alarma que suena para advertirnos no ya de un problema que vendrá, sino de un problema que ya está aquí y que podríamos resumirlo diciendo que las nuevas tecnologías se han convertido en un peligro para nuestra persona, nuestra individualidad, nuestra libertad, nuestras sociedades, nuestra democracia. ¿Es así? ¿Es tan grave el problema, señor Zuboff?
Well, you know, I have some perspective now since the many years of writing, 7 years of writing, and the book was first published over a year ago now. So I have some perspective, and I think I can summarize for you now in a way that would have been much more difficult a year ago. But if I were to summarize right now, I would say this, and that is that there is no such thing as technology by itself. Technology always lives in history, it lives in society, and most of all, it lives in our economy. What's happened right now is a very odd, startling, invasive, and consequential economic logic that I call surveillance capitalism has hijacked digital technology, has hijacked the dominant technology of our century. It has taken off, it has filled the space, it has had a free run to do whatever it wants, and it has had this freedom because we did not understand it, and we have no laws to truly protect ourselves from its action. So here we are in the digital century with digital technology owned and operated by a surveillance economics. And as citizens of democracies, despite the GDPR, despite the many conversations and the laws that people are working on and some of the laws that we already have in place, we are essentially marching naked through this century without the appropriate charters of rights, without the appropriate legal frameworks, without the appropriate regulatory paradigms and the new institutions that we need to protect ourselves in this digital century so that we can assure that the digital technologies that are developed and deployed are not only compatible with democracy, but that actually advance the prospect of democratic values and principles and participation for our future, for the future of the 21st century. That, I believe, is a way of summarizing the challenge that we face today. We have been naked, and now it's time for us to all, we say in English, it's time for us to all suit up, for us to put on the gear, put on what we need to make this digital century a democratic century.
Un elemento central de su libro es el que nos dice que estos efectos indeseados de algunos casos de las tecnologías, como son pues, la acumulación de datos que se han apoderado de nuestras vidas, que nos conocen mejor que nosotros mismos, que pueden prevenir lo que vamos a hacer, que pueden incluso manipular lo que queremos hacer, no es una consecuencia indeseada de las nuevas tecnologías, como una especie de derivada incontrolada, sino que tiene unos responsables, o sea que hay alguien intencionadamente actuando en este sentido. Este es el capítulo para mí central. No es que usted denuncie algunas cosas que se nos están yendo un poco de las manos. Usted denuncia que hay intenciones directas, perfectamente planificadas para llevar esto y para llevarlo hasta sus últimas consecuencias. ¿Es así?
Well, let me say that what you describe as far as consequences are correct. But over and over again, you'll hear me make this distinction These are not inevitable consequences of digital technology. May I offer a quick example? Yes? A quick example. You know, let's go back to the year 2000, before surveillance capitalism became something that we could recognize in the public realm. In the year 2000, at one of our great technical universities in the United States, Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology, a group of frontier engineers, designers, data scientists created a project. They called it the Aware Home. The Aware Home. So that meant the same thing that today we call a smart home. And in their discussions of the Aware Home, they published many papers and technical papers. And in one of their technical papers, they show the engineering diagram for the Aware Home. And it's a very simple closed loop, as they say in engineering. So there are sensors in the home itself, in the walls and so forth. And they stream data to a little computer that the person who lives in the home, they imagine maybe they would wear this little thing on their belt. And it's only the resident, it's only the inhabitant of the home who gets these data. And then they have some tools for interpreting the data, deciding what they want to do with those data, maybe their energy consumption, or maybe some other things they discover about how to improve their home, their ability to communicate with other family members who are outside of the home. And when the engineers describe this very simple diagram, they say the data that are being generated by these sensors and cameras, these are very intimate data. They must be held, of course, in private. Only the inhabitants of the home receive the data. Only they know the data. Only they're in charge of the data. Only they have authority over the data. Only they decide how these data are used. This is what the engineers said. All right, that's the year 2000. Now, let us fast forward through time to the year 2017, not so long ago. 2017, we have a company that was purchased by Google called Nest. It made devices for the smart home. Subsequently, after 2017, Nest has been completely internalized into Alphabet as part of what is called Google Home. But at this point, Nest was a subsidiary of Alphabet. They're making devices for the smart home. There are two scholars at the University of London who did a very interesting analysis. They took one Nest thermostat that you might put in your bedroom wall, for example, and they did an analysis based on not only its privacy policy, but really tracing where all the data that this thermostat collected, where it went. And then as it went to third parties, what were their privacy policies and where did they stream the data? And on and on and on. And the conclusion that they came to, friends, was that if you are even a moderately cautious consumer and you install one Nest thermostat, you should be reviewing a minimum of 1,000 privacy contracts before you turn that thermostat on. Okay, so what is the difference between the smart home in the year 2000 and the smart home in the year 2017? It's not the technology. The difference is the economic logic that has grabbed hold of the technology. The technology becomes that fabled Trojan horse concealing within an economic logic. Now, what I have done in the book is I have deconstructed this economic logic to show its imperatives, its iron laws. Once you understand its imperatives, then you can predict the consequences. You can predict its actions. And the things that make headlines in our countries every single day, Google did this, Facebook did that, Microsoft did this, Amazon did that, even Apple is in there to a certain extent. Every single headline that you read, I promise you, can be not only predicted but understood. Once you grasp the economic logic, its imperatives, how the actors in these companies are compelled to operate, and the decisions that they are compelled to make if they are going to continue to drive for the profit and the market capitalization that has made them the richest companies in the history of modern commerce.
Y además va creciendo exponencialmente, avanzando a una gran velocidad. Este proceso que usted nos cuenta, que la tecnología tenía una lógica, pero que fue derrotada por una lógica, pues, no sé, económica, voraz, insaciable, marca usted una fecha. ¿Por qué marca usted una fecha? Incluso abre un capítulo marcando una fecha, de agosto del año 2011, momento en el que usted dice, se pasa un poco una página de la historia de este proceso.
Well, a number of things happened at that point that I think set the stage for the following decade, which was a decade in which surveillance capitalism, which was already established, really took off and became far more invasive. But what happened on that day that first caught my eye as a convergence of so many developments, that was a day. All right, now let's think about this. 2011, so we're talking about 9 years ago. On that day, if you turned on the news, you were likely to have heard an announcer talking with great energy and enthusiasm about something very important that had happened that afternoon. And that was that Apple Inc., Apple Corporation, surpassed ExxonMobil to be the company with the highest rate of market capitalization in the US stock market. So Apple took the #1 place away from the fossil fuel industry. Now, it's interesting that we're talking about this right now because in just the last few days, something else very important has happened, which is that ExxonMobil was dropped from the S&P 500, the Standard & Poor's 500, which is one of the main indices in the US stock market for the great blue chip companies. So 9 years ago, ExxonMobil lost first place. Today, just about a decade later, it's not even in the major index of 500 companies. That shows you how fast this phenomenon is moving. All of the top companies now in market capitalization, all the top 5 are the tech companies. All of them are surveillance capitalists. Apple is a more complex case, but is certainly deeply embroiled and enabling surveillance capitalism in a whole variety of ways. So it cannot be considered an innocent player in this group. So this is one of the key points on that August 11th. Now, other things were happening. There were riots in London during those same days. So here we have the tech sector taking off, starting to really show how it was going to dominate our economy, dominate wealth creation. And at the same time, our societies were being pulled apart by levels of poverty, economic inequality, exclusion from social participation, suffering, polarization, in a way that we literally hadn't seen since the late 19th century. So we have this one group on the rise, while among our citizenry, there is suffering, there is poverty, and there is a debilitating, increasing inequality, lack of opportunity that is producing violence in our societies. That violence has grown year by year. And during this past year, we've all seen a return to the violence in the streets, over inequality, over poverty, over racism, which is so entwined with this scourge of inequality. So we see just a decade ago this kind of crucible of the turn that we took in our societies away from the public sphere, away from inclusion, away from democracy, away from solidarity, away from our belief in society and our belief in democracy. And we saw these forces begin to announce themselves that were pulling us apart. And as we all suffered, it was the tech companies that were on the rise. And that day, August 11th, 2011, is a day that all of that was visible. All of that was visible on the dashboard of history. And that's why I began on that theme.
Me impresiona mucho, señora Zuboff, cuando usted nos cuenta que este avance, que no se detiene y que crece, como digo, exponencialmente, no se conforma con conocer nuestros datos y ponerlos a la venta, sino que tiene vocación de ser el ojo de Dios. Tiene vocación de penetrar en nuestra intimidad, en nuestros sentimientos. Y no solamente decidir cosas, sino modificar nuestra conducta. Este capítulo de la modificación de la conducta también es un paso adelante que da muchísimo miedo. Tienen capacidad, las tecnologías están ya ahora mismo, de hecho, actuando en ese capítulo, como factores con capacidad de modificar nuestra conducta.
Oh, unfortunately, the answer is yes. And not only can they do that at scale, and they can do that in ways that we never become aware of. So the answer is yes. And as I know you appreciate, this is an arena that I spend an awful lot of time trying to understand, because of course it's the work itself that inside the companies that produces these effects is hidden. They're not bragging about it. It's hidden. So it takes some time to piece it together. But here, if I may, let me go back to this idea of economic imperatives, because I said to you, I made a promise that if you understand the economic imperatives, these things become less surprising and more predictable. So when we talk about surveillance capitalism, number one, we're talking about a startling economic logic for the following reason. Capitalism has always evolved by taking things that live outside the marketplace and bringing them into the market so that they can be turned into commodities, things that can be sold and purchased. And surveillance capitalism follows that pattern, but with a dark twist. What does surveillance capitalism claim for the market? It looked around the world and it realized that, boy, just about everything that can be commoditized has been commoditized. What's left? And that's when it discovered the young folks, the young entrepreneurs, the founders, the engineers, the data scientists at Google in the years 2000, 2001 made the discovery that the one thing that had not yet been commoditized was our private human experience. And the way in which our private experience could be claimed as raw material for new processes of datafication. And then those new flows of behavioral data begin, they come from all kinds of interfaces. At first it started with, searching and browsing online. Then it jumped to our phones. Then it jumped to all the apps on our phones. Now there are cameras and devices and wearables and sensors on our bodies, in our homes, on our streets, in our cities, in our cars. All of these things have become supply chain interfaces. So the data being translated from our experiences flows into these complex pipes of supply chains, and it carries them to the new factories. Supply chains go to factories, as they always have. But these are 21st century factories, computational factories. And what is produced here are computational products, specifically predictions of our behavior. They don't just take our behavior and sell it. They don't just sell our personal information. They analyze it in order to predict what we will do. So so they're selling it to whom? Not to us. It's about us, but it's not for us. They're selling it to business customers who want to make bets on what we will do next. That's how they're making money. So these are markets that trade exclusively in human futures. Now, the shorthand here is that surveillance capitalists are selling certainty. Think about the very first successful markets in human futures. They were called online targeted advertising markets. What was the prediction they were selling? The prediction they were selling, they called it the click-through rate. And they were selling a prediction of where you or I would click and whether we would click through to the website behind a certain ad that we saw on our screen, right? So that was the click-through rate. Now that's simply a prediction of our behavior, a little computational fragment. And look at the markets that have been created to buy and sell that prediction. In fact, essentially all of Google's market capitalization and all of Facebook's market capitalization, even at this point, come from this exchange. So if you're selling predictions, you're selling certainty. And what do you need to sell certainty in that AI factory that you run? Well, number one, you need a lot of data, economies of scale. Number two, you need varieties of data, economies of scope. Then they discovered in the competitive heat, they discovered that the most predictive data comes from actually using the digital surround, the digital instrumentation around us to push, herd, tune, shepherd, manipulate, and modify to shift our behavior in the direction that aligns with their commercial goals and their clients' commercial goals. So they've learned how to do this in a way that bypasses our awareness. We don't know about it, therefore, obviously, we're not consenting to it. These are things that happen through subliminal cues, online social comparison dynamics. They happen through very subtle ways of rewarding or punishing behavior in real time. They happen in all of these ways that affect us, but don't actually rise to the level of our consciousness. And as a result, as one engineer that I interviewed, he put it this way: we don't have to come after you to make you do something. We've learned how to engineer the context around you. And he put it in actually a very beautiful metaphorical way. He said, we learned how to write the music, and then we let the music make you dance. And that's the situation that we're in today. And I'm happy to give lots of examples if we have time and if that interests you.
Por eso menciona usted que estamos a la venta como un mercado humano de futuros, así como hay un mercado de futuros de semillas, por ejemplo. Ahora estamos siendo observados así. El ser humano, yo, usted, formamos parte del mercado humano de futuros. Estamos a la venta directamente, ¿no? Es muy impresionante esa metáfora, a mi juicio. Lo del mercado de futuros me parece como un saco de semillas.
Yes, and specifically, yes, and it's specifically our future behavior that's being sold. Because, you know, there is that saying that if it's free, you're the product. And what I've tried to stress that if I'm the product, you know, a company has to take some care of its product. But these companies have no interest in taking care of us. All they want to do is lift the data from us that can be computed into predictions. The data goes to the artificial intelligence factory and is computed into predictions. And the real customer, the people that they want to take care of, are the businesses that are buying these predictions. So, for example, you know, because surveillance capitalism operates through surveillance, you know, it's hidden and it's hard to find out about it. That's one reason I you know, took me so long to study and research. But we rely a lot on whistleblowers and leaked documents. These things become very important sources for us. And I had over 50 data scientists, mostly in Silicon Valley, who talked to me off the record anonymously because they didn't want to be identified because of the companies that they worked for. So this is how we learn about it. But there was a leaked document from Facebook back in 2018 that gave us a view into its computational factory, its artificial intelligence hub, they called it. And what they said was that their AI they use the word ingesting, essentially eating. Their AI is eating trillions of data points every day in order to produce 6 million behavioral predictions every second. Every second. So this is the scope of their power. Because when you know everything, when you know more than the people whom you've taken these data from, they have built these concentrations of knowledge about us as individuals, as groups, and across our societies, as populations. So they have these concentrations of knowledge that are literally unimaginable in any other moment in human history because they depend upon digital technology. So with these great concentrations of knowledge come great concentrations of power. Data scientists talk about the shift from what they call monitoring, which is just collecting a lot of data about a system, to what they call actuation, which is actually being able to use all of the data about a system to go back in and automate it, control it, make it do things, actuate it from afar. And when they spoke to me about this, they said, this is where we are now with human systems. We know so much about your behavior, or this group's behavior, or this city's behavior, or this society's behavior, that we know how to use all of that knowledge to go back in through the medium of the digital, through the medium of all these instruments that are everywhere in our surroundings, and use that to actuate, to actually touch, shape, shift, and change how people behave. That makes it more lucrative for us, that aligns with our economic incentives. Economies of scale, economies of scope, and this final dimension is what I call economies of action. Economies of action. No one has ever been able to do that before. So, final word here. We can easily imagine digital technology without surveillance capitalism. Remember my example of the aware home. That's an easy one. It is impossible to imagine surveillance capitalism without the digital, right? This is how we begin to tease these things apart, and how we understand that our challenge now is not to, destroy all technology. Our challenge is to mobilize law so that we interrupt and outlaw surveillance capitalism as a rogue economic logic that has predictably dangerous consequences for people and for democracy. And when we do that, we open up the playing field for all kinds of new true innovators who want to use the digital and use it to actually solve our problems, not just to make money by selling our futures to business customers who want to control our behavior in alignment with their economic interests, but actually to use artificial intelligence, to use data for the social good, to really help our lives, to cure income inequality, to make our economies flourish, to produce lots of doctors and teachers, not remote learning and remote medicine, to solve the crisis of our climate, to solve so many diseases. These are the things that digital technology is supposed to be doing for us, but it's not. It's wholly dedicated now to the economic aims and interests of surveillance capitalists and their clients.
No lo hace y podría hacerlo, o ya está prisionera, porque usted nos habla de una superestructura que está mencionando, a la que le bautiza con el nombre de el gran otro. El gran otro es, me imagino, la superestructura que nos está dibujando, ¿no? ¿Hay posibilidades de luchar contra ese gran otro? ¿Hay posibilidades? Muchos de los más importantes jóvenes expertos ingenieros en computación que han trabajado en estas.
All right. Well, you've raised such an important point, and I'm so glad that you have, because the question over and over is it too late? Is all of this inevitable now? Is it too late? I don't know how strongly I can convey this to all of you. I am positive that it is not too late. This is not a problem for ethics. You will hear people talking about, oh, we need ethical AI, ethical artificial intelligence. We need ethical technology. We need humane technology. Forget about that. We are way past the point when those conversations can be meaningful. We need law. We need new democratic institutions. We need new charters of rights that protect our experience. We need to outlaw the very financial incentives that drive this economic logic. For example, I've just described to you these markets that trade in human futures, right? Like we have markets that trade in other kinds of commodity futures, like wheat futures or pork futures or whatever it might be. We now have markets that trade in human futures. And these markets are making these companies super wealthy. So my view is these markets must be outlawed because we can show that they undermine human autonomy. What the competitive dynamics, economies of scale, scope, and action that require success in a human futures market, that make for competitive success, undermine human autonomy. They take away our freedom. They take away what I call our right to the future tense. Without human autonomy, without decision rights over the boundaries of my own experience, who knows about me, what it is they know, and how that knowledge is used, those are rights that should all accrue to the citizen of any democratic society. So we need to understand that these kinds of fundamental issues of autonomy, individual sovereignty are being targeted here and are being diminished. And without those qualities, our democratic societies are impossible to imagine. So that's at the grassroots level, at the individual level. But let's look at the superstructure, as you mentioned. At the superstructure level, we see, here we are. We're entering into the third decade of the digital century. This was supposed to be democracy's golden age, the democratization of knowledge, the distribution of information. This was supposed to be our best time. Instead, we're entering this decade looking at something more like a feudal pattern, a medieval pattern of these huge concentrations of knowledge in the hands of a few, where the gap between what I can know and what I can know about and what they can know about me is growing every day. The gap between what I can know and what they can know about me is just amplifying every single day. And of course, the more they know about me, the more they can do to me. So the gap between what I can do and what can be done to me is also growing. Knowledge and power. These great concentrations of knowledge and power in the hands of a few companies. This is fundamentally anti-democratic. This is on a collision course with our democratic institutions. And if we allow that to continue, there will come a time when the road back will be very difficult, when the road back will require a kind of mobilization and violence that I never want to see become necessary. Right now, we are not there yet. Yes, they're making money. Yes, they are very wealthy. Yes, they have these huge concentrations of knowledge and power, but we still have democracy. And democracy is the one thing that they fear. Here's what they fear. They fear democratic citizens who say no to surveillance capitalism, to its operations. They fear lawmakers who do not fear them. They fear lawmakers who are willing to listen to citizens. They fear lawmakers and citizens who are willing to work together to move us into the digital century in a way that builds the new rights and laws and institutions that we need. And most of all, the surveillance capitalists fear law. They have had 20 years of an essentially lawless run. So the reason to be optimistic here is it's not like we've been trying to stop them. Number one, we've barely understood what they do. Number two, because we've barely understood it, we have not been aggressive with law that can interrupt and outlaw these kinds of pernicious, dangerous operations. So we haven't really tried yet. We haven't mobilized yet. It's like, if you look back into the late 19th century, you know, there was a period we were moving into the decades of industrial capitalism and its violence, the unique violence associated with industrial capitalism. But there was a period when we didn't have the right to join a union. We didn't have the right to strike or to bargain collectively. Where we didn't have laws, for example, like child labor laws that were national in scope. We didn't have institutions to protect workers for fair wages and fair treatment and fair working conditions. We didn't have the laws and institutions to protect consumers so that what we eat and drink is safe, that it won't kill us, that it'll keep us healthy. We didn't have really any of the laws and institutions that we depended on throughout the later decades of the 20th century and that we depend on still. There was a moment when we had to roll up our sleeves and get to work with the immensely creative vision of developing those rights, laws, and institutions to make the 20th century safe, ultimately for democracy. And I understand it was a violent century, and we endured 2 horrific wars. But on the side of our economy, we came out with economies that worked for many people in the society and were tethered to democratic principles through law, rights, and regulation. This is the kind of creativity that we need today. We've begun it. Europe has begun it. The EU and the leaders of the EU are determined to continue it. Even in the United States, which has been a laggard, we see a new mobilization, a new level of awareness. 26 laws, 26 not laws, I apologize, 26 important pieces of legislation introduced into Congress just over the past year, which is a record in this field in the United States, which has, as I said, been slow to come to this. Very important new law getting on the books and being discussed in Britain, in the UK. So we have a lot that's happening. We have populations, people, folks like you and me feeling mobilized all around the world. Everywhere that I traveled over the past year and a half, I went out to talk about my book and I thought I'd be back in 3 weeks. And I came home 14 months later. And instead of diminishing the people who came to this discussion, the numbers grew. 1,000 people in the room, sometimes every day, sometimes twice a day. Everybody that I spoke with, they said the same things. We're worried about democracy. We're worried about freedom. We're worried about autonomy. We're worried about the future. We're worried about manipulation. We're worried about control. We are mobilized. I am persuaded of that. Every single attitude survey of any scale shows the same thing. Whenever people have a choice, we hate these operations. We're looking for ways to hide from them. This is not what we choose. So, looked at from this perspective, surveillance capitalism is a massive market failure. It succeeds because we've gotten to a point where there are no alternatives. Everything that we try to do forces us to march through surveillance capitalism supply chains. Whether we're interfacing with our children's schooling, now more than ever, whether we're interfacing with our health data now more than ever, whether we're just trying to get online to make plans with friends and family for dinner or to have a conversation. Everything we do forces us to march through their supply chains. So we have no alternatives. We don't understand well what they're doing. And they've told us that all of this is an inevitable, they've told us that all of this is an inevitable consequence of technology, that their hands are tied, there's nothing they can do. So, you know, we have this term in English, I don't know if you're using it in Spain, we call it gaslighting. The idea that, you know, they've mastered rhetoric to really confuse us and misdirect our understanding in a way that it gets very, very disorienting. The bottom line is all of this can be fixed, but it's going to take us, our lawmakers, and our democracies to fix it.
Usted expresa mucha preocupación, algo que es muy preocupante, que es el mundo de los adolescentes, que sí que está ya atrapado, completamente atrapado, este nuevo universo que está usted contando y que tiene muchas ventajas y muchísimos inconvenientes. A partir sobre todo de dos cosas, el temor a perderse algo, y la necesidad de estar siempre siendo reconocido por los demás, tener muchos likes, ser muy querido por los demás, está convirtiendo a nuestros adolescentes en seres especialmente manipulables. El otro día, en una serie documental en la que usted participa, por cierto, se llama The Social Dilemma, en el cual se muestra un gráfico que me hizo mucha impresión. El número de suicidios de adolescentes. Una cosa escandalosa. En los últimos 6 o 7 años se ha multiplicado como por 200 el número de suicidios en adolescentes por no ser suficientemente queridos o no tener suficientes likes o no estar siendo suficiente guapo o suficiente guapa. Ese universo da más miedo, ¿no, señorita Zuboff? Porque están ya viviendo atrapados en esa lógica, atrapados. ¿Eh? Y ese es especialmente vulnerable, ¿no?
Yes. Yes, you're absolutely right. I am very concerned about our young people because adolescence and young adulthood, you know, is a very vulnerable time, because when we come into adolescence without a developed sense of self, and the way we know who we are when we're younger, and just about anybody can think back to an earlier time in life and identify with what I'm about to say. The way we know ourselves when we're younger is through our reflection in another person's eyes. So, you know, we want to be accepted and we want to be recognized. We want to be included in the group, because it's only through how we see ourselves in the other's eyes that we feel alive. Well, don't forget that Facebook was invented by some boys. Facebook was invented essentially by adolescents, you know, young boys at university who were very much in this kind of adolescent mentality, where if you're 14 or 15 or 16 or 17, depending on somewhat whether you're a boy or girl, to be honest, we won't go into that, but also, you know, just your personality and a bunch of other things, but how fast you're developing, and that's a function of many different random things in life. But anyway, these young people who invented Facebook, they were absolutely in the heart of this mentality. Like, you know, what is the good? The good is, oh, other people like you. What is the good? Oh, other people check out your face and they think you're cute and they want to know you. this adolescent mentality was institutionalized in the structure of Facebook. And when they created the like, you know, it made it even worse, because then you have a continuous metric of whether or not, you know, they like me. If they like me, I exist, right? It's this very existential kind of Shakespearean problem. If they don't like me, who am I? Because the lights have gone out. There's no mirror. There's no illumination. It's a dark room. If they don't like me, I can't see myself. Now, young people suffer with this. You know, you put up a post and you can't tear yourself away until you see if it's starting to collect likes. You put up a picture, you can't tear yourself away until you see if it's starting to get recognition. People suffer with this. Young people suffer with this. Now, let's go back to what we talked about before: economies of action, subliminal cues, unconscious forms of interpersonal comparison, ways of rewarding and punishing in real time. When you live in the digital milieu, in the digital surround, and by the way, this whole digital architecture is what I refer to as not just a big brother who's up there and has a political motivation to survey us and make us do what he wants us to do. I call this big other. I call this digital architecture that's all around us big other, not big brother. Big other is not totalitarian. Big other does not want to drag us off to the gulag or the camp. Big other wants one thing only. Big other wants our data. Big other wants to grab everything from our experience, to turn it into data, to send it into the pipes and the factory and the sales and the markets. That's big other. Now our children are captured in this architecture of big other. Big other wants their data, right? So this brings us right down to Facebook today. What are we reading in the headlines every day, especially when we're talking about politics and upcoming elections in the United States, for example? What we're seeing is that what's on Facebook gets more and more violent, more and more controversial, more and more outrageous. Why is that? Well, that's not being done by people, that's being done by algorithms. Remember that algorithmic hub and the 6 million predictions per second and the trillions of data points coming in to help build those algorithms? So what those trillions of data points are showing is that there's all these volumes of different kinds of data that are occurring, coming into the Facebook supply chains. And what the predictions say is that more people will look at stuff that's violent, more people will look at stuff that's full of rage, more people will look at stuff that's mean, then we'll look at stuff that's nice, stuff that's kind, stuff that is calm, stuff that is peaceful. So the algorithms are constantly on this evolution toward favoring the worst content, the most destructive, most dangerous, most outrageous content. That's how the machine works. That's how big other works. Because big other does not care about us. It doesn't care about our political persuasion. At the end of 1984, when Orwell is writing about Big Brother wanted to dominate Winston's soul. It wasn't enough that Winston did the right behavior. Big Brother had to know that he dominated Winston from the inside out. That's not where we are, folks. This is not totalitarianism. This is what I call instrumentarian power. It works through the medium of digital instrumentation to shape our behavior. It really doesn't care what we think or feel. It only cares that we think and feel in ways that allow it to get the data, right? So this is the world that our young people are living in. I call it the society of the hive. Think about a beehive. So they're reacting to one another constantly in real time. So collective behavior is constantly shaped by what one another are doing. This is how the beehive functions. This is how the anthill functions. This is the model of human society in the future if surveillance capitalism and its instrumentarian power are allowed to dominate, are allowed to thrive. Society becomes a hive. We have the people in the hive and the people outside who tune the hive, who tune the algorithms so that all the behavior in the hive flows the way that they prefer, largely toward their economic objectives. In China, some of these same capabilities have been fused with the Chinese authoritarian state's political objectives. And in China, you see a kind of future society where you have the building of the hive, but not for economic outcomes, for political outcomes, to build a certain kind of society and a certain kind of authoritarian a hierarchy of the governed and the governors. So that is one possible future, this hive society, and our children are being trained in it. So what does this mean? Can we pull them out? Of course. Of course we can. What do they need? They need all the things that we have always needed as young people to begin to get us to reflect on ourselves and to develop an inner sense of self. They need to build an inner world. Let me give you an example. A very important survey, I refer to it someplace in the book, but it's always meant a lot to me. There was a big survey that Gallup did with some universities, and they picked some graduates of universities, and they judged these graduates based on how successful they were, not only economically, but their sense of well-being, their sense of being successful people in their lives, and so forth. And then they took the successful ones and they asked them, what was it about your educational experience when you went to college, university, that helped you become this successful person? And they asked all these different young people this question. And to summarize, it all came down to basically one thing. Are you ready? It all came down to, when I was at school, I had a teacher, a professor, a mentor who thought that I was special, who believed that I had a special contribution to make. And this person listened to me. This person helped me develop my thoughts and helped me put my energies to work. And when and asked me questions and forced me to reflect on my own answers and how to solve problems my own way. And that was how I began to build my identity and my sense of self, my sense that I could make a contribution. This is the essence of how each of us develops an inner world. So, you know, when you hear that saying that we hear so much out there, when you move through the world of surveillance capitalism and you hear these folks talk and you hear the advice that they give you, you will hear them say to you, hey, you know, if you have something to hide, then maybe you shouldn't be doing it, right? If you have nothing to hide, then you have nothing to worry about from us. That's the kind of thing that you say, how they diminish our need for sanctuary and privacy and autonomy and solitude, because these are the spaces where we develop our inner life. My answer, and remember this, if anybody says that to you, here's the answer. You tell them, if you have nothing to hide, then you are nothing. If you have nothing to hide, then you are nothing. Because our inner lives are meant to be private. Our inner sanctuary is where we develop our sense of self, where we develop our thoughts and feelings, where we develop our creativity, not just as a mirror of what do the others say? Do the others like it? What do the others want me to do? Will the others accept me? But as a contributing creative self. Now, is self enough? Is self alone enough? No. But selves, autonomous selves, who can think critically, who can reference our own values and ideals, that's how we come together as a strong democratic society. That's how we stand together as democratic citizens and say, this is enough. This is intolerable. This violates our most basic assumptions of a good society. This violates our aspirations as a democratic people. And we stand together and we can make the choice as people with an inner life and inner values. We can make the choice to stand together because that sense of self gives us the courage to stand in solidarity. So you see, solidarity and sanctuary, our public life and our inner life, are joined as two sides of the same coin. Without our society, without our democratic institutions, we have no rights. We have no sovereign individuals. But if we are only isolated in ourselves, we have no democracy. So these things are joined together. And when they try to take away our individual sovereignty, they know that they are killing our democracy. So this is why families, sisters and brothers, friends, mamas and papas, everybody, cousins, aunties and uncles, everybody is joined together to tell our young people, you are special. I see you. I know you. I know what you are capable of. Come, let's do this. Let's solve this problem. Let's think these thoughts. Let's read these books. Let's discover our identities together. Let's go outside. Let's climb a tree. Let's do all of the things that help us restore that balance of our sense of sanctuary and our inner life, because in the end, these are resources that our young people will draw upon to create this digital and democratic century that we all want.
Estaba pensando ahora que, antes de concluir, que en la sociedad actual se da una paradoja, que es la sociedad más incrédula y la más crédula a la vez. Es muy escéptica, pero se cree cualquier cosa. Y ahora mismo esta sensación de estar siendo manipulados está siendo utilizado por algunos para rechazar todo, hacerse terraplanista, antivacuna, opuesto a todo, negando la existencia del COVID-19, etcétera, etcétera. Ahora hay una especie de corriente de contestación descontrolada, como consecuencia de esta sociedad infantilizada que no sabe ya ni lo que cree ni lo que deja de creer. Yo no sé si eso le parece preocupante o no, pero esa corriente que se ve avanzar, que de pronto eso, se hace terraplanista, antivacuna, se opone a absolutamente todo, porque siempre ve detrás la mano que nos manipula.
Well, this goes back, I'm sad to say, to the algorithms. You know, if we were to take 100%, just imagine for a moment, if we could take 100% of the human-generated information on Facebook, it would not, the majority of that 100% would not be the crazy stuff, the incendiary stuff, the dangerous stuff. That would not be a majority if we could look at this, just in a fictional universe of 100% of the content on that platform at any given moment. What's happening is that the algorithms are rewarding that content. They're showing it more. They're distributing it more. So even though in an absolute sense, it doesn't have a majority, in the experiential sense of what we see every day, it dominates. This is because of the algorithms. Why? Because the algorithms are programmed for engagement. Why? Because the more we are engaged, the more of our experience they are taking to turn into data, and the more they are able to fill their supply chains. Trillions of data points ingested every day, 6 million predictions produced every second. You don't get those kinds of numbers without algorithms designed to maximize outrage, right? You know this phenomenon. You're on the highway and there's a terrible, you're on the highway and suddenly everything slows down, right? And you can't see ahead. Why has everything slowed down? And then little by little, you get to the head of the queue and you see everything slowed down because there was a terrible accident. Everybody stopped to look at the accident and maybe slow down your movement on the highway for an hour, right? But if you're on the highway and everything is beautiful and the flowers are blooming and the trees, no one is stopping. Everyone's going to their destination. It's like that with data. The algorithms are putting those ugly accidents in our path so that we stop and we engage. And the more we engage, the more data Big Other is able to ingest. The more data, the bigger the volume, the more the nutrition that goes into the artificial intelligence, the more it can eat, the more it can know, and the better are its predictions. And so they win the economic game in these markets that trade in our futures. So this is an economics problem. This has to do with the financial incentives within these companies. We outlaw those financial incentives. We come a long way toward absolutely stopping this problem. It's within our grasp. Politics, not technology.
Terminamos ya, Shoshana. Bueno, este libro fantástico que tenemos aquí, que es, por un lado, como un cañonazo de advertencia, como una sirena de alarma, pero es también como una llamada a la movilización democrática. Lo he entendido así. Finalmente, es una invitación, digamos, a reaccionar democráticamente. ¿Es así?
I'm so pleased to hear you say that, because that is exactly my intention. There is a powerful phenomenon here, and I try to unveil so many aspects of it that have been hidden from us, so that we can be empowered, so that we stop feeling helpless, so we stop feeling resigned, so we stop believing what they tell us, that this is an inevitable feature of digital technology. We understand that we have democracy on our side. Democracy is slow. That is not a criticism. Democracy is slow because it depends upon the conversations that we have in our families, in our communities, in our neighborhoods, around the kitchen table, with our politicians, with our elected officials. We take a little bit to mobilize, to grow. But once we do so, democracy is powerful. That is what we have to mobilize right now, the third decade. We are on the brink of the third decade. This is the decade that has been given to us to turn this around, to reclaim the digital century for our lives and for democracy. That is the work now, and thank you so much for the deep and careful and thoughtful reading of my book, because that really makes me feel like all these years have been worthwhile, and I'm very grateful for that.
Shoshana Zuboff, muchas gracias. Ha sido un honor. Un saludo desde España.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Saludos, saludos y gracias a todos.
Gracias por su donación. Preservar la cultura está en nuestras manos. Ayúdenos a afianzar nuestras acciones y continuar imaginando un mundo mejor.